Hi class, welcome back from spring break. I am looking forward to looking at your photo essays that were due as soon as you got back. Those should be graded within a week following the guidelines on your syllabus. Um, we are starting back on module information here as you're entering spring. Spring begins tomorrow, doesn't it? Um, as we look at healthcare and medicine, as well as looking at disabilities. Now, this is a 2-week module. The first week we'll look at healthcare and medicine, basically the information from your text, additional information as you are going to be looking at it. And then we're going to look at disabilities and why disabilities is an important issue to look at within social problems. So no surprise to many of you, I am a medical sociologist. That was my focus of study, was medicine, looking at aging, healthcare, life expectancies, all of those things. Medical sociologists look at the healthcare system, the pecking order, as we look at how they're formed, just as every other system in society, like family. And we also look at those statistics that make a difference, that come into place. Those birth rates, those infant death rates, women living longer, the expectations and the experiences of illness of both genders. So many things that have already come up in this class as we really look at what's in place related to healthcare systems. So you're going to look at 2 small short videos as well, and we'll come back to those in a few minutes after we look at the PowerPoint. Now, healthcare is a topic that you hear a lot about as we watch the fight going back and forth whether we need a national health care plan, what they call Obamacare, which is actually the Affordable Care Act. But let's look at part of the issues here, that in the United States, heart disease remains the leading cause of death still in this country, and there's been little progress in lowering infant mortality rates. So that's pretty significant. We have infant mortality rates that align ourselves with some of the countries in the world that are poorer than the typical way that we think of ourselves aligning with European, Japan, those countries with more modern societies. There is a significant difference based on our racial or ethnic group that we belong into. So we know the poor health of the American Indian, the poor health of the Black population, and the poor racial division as well for Hispanics. So people who are living from those groups are more likely to have more illness, and those who are in poverty or near the poverty line, 200% of the poverty line, in other words, the working poor, are more likely to have health issues. They're more likely to be uninsured. Now, interesting, talking about insurance, the Affordable Care Act requires that we all carry insurance. That's one of the pieces of it that is being dismantled right now, that we are not going to be required to have insurance in place, that it becomes part of that process. So lots of things to consider here as we start looking at the issues of health. Now, life expectancy by birth, you can see the differences here as you look at the statistics. So as we look at all races, life expectancies for male, 2010, 76. By the way, it has dropped a little bit in this decade. 81 for females. For whites, it ranges in that way. You can see it's very, very close because they are the majority population, but for blacks, it's a significant drop of almost 5 years for males, and for women, about 3. And we don't even have some of the other minorities that are highly affected. Again, like I told you, Native Americans, much more lower life expectancy across the board. So, the sociology perspective on health and illness, we can start thinking through our sociological imagination. Remember, put that back on, and I'm sure you had to have that on if you were working on your photo project over break. But we need to understand the relationship between health and illness. They're pretty, health, illness, and society, pretty important. In my class, in the classroom, we do a silly little assignment where you go on and you buy groceries. During the poverty chapter, you see what you can buy based on your income. Start thinking about what populations eat based on their income or what they're exposed to or their housing environment or their jobs and what they're affected by. That medicine can identify these biological pathways to disease, but the sociological perspective addresses some of these social determinants of health, like our family background, where we grow up, how we experience, and we investigate that political economy that is going on in the midst of this course as we explore what the government's doing about things. So, a number of things to think about within this chapter is the sociology of health and illness includes epidemiology, and that's the study of the patterns of illness. So right now, as I'm recording this again 4 weeks early for those working ahead, start thinking about the flu epidemic. Here we are at one of the worst flu outbreaks the country has had for a long period of time. Sociologists will study not only the medical issues that come into place, that distribution of illness and the frequency of illness, which are very important, but where the illness hits and how to study it. And they study how health and illnesses are experienced based on different social factors such as gender, age, race, social class, and behavior. And it's interesting, as I've been reading on the flu problems, they have focused a great deal on children. And yet the highest rate of death right now has been older adults as we start looking at the effects of flu. So not only do we look at who is affected, but then we start looking at those other pieces like media, where they're focusing on and how it comes into place as we study things. So from the sociological perspective on, we look at fertility, and that's the level of childbearing for individuals in the population. We look at mortality, that's the incidence of death in the population, and we especially look too at infant mortality as we look at infants who die, infant death in that infant level of that first period of life, that year coming into place and before. And so these statistics, along with morbidity statistics, the study of illness, are pretty important. So as you explore this, no surprise as we jump back to some of the perspectives of what comes in place. The functionalist perspectives say illness is a legitimate place in society. And Talcott Parsons writes a theory that comes very well quoted for a long period of time called the sick role. And the sick role examines the legitimacy of illness, how society expects that person to behave. It has two parts. And in the first part, it looks for how we recognize the illness. And the second part looks at how we seek the authority of a physician to manage the illness. And we give basically that person a pass based on illness. Now, it also turns over the power of the individual to the healthcare provider. From the functionalist perspective as well, the medical industry has a function. It's a very much part of our social structure. We have this shift pattern that has come into place from the general practitioner model to the specialist model, and we can see that there are both functions and dysfunctions as we change that pattern of care. And the economic piece of it are definitely part of that structure. From the conflict perspective, conflict theorists identify the patterns of health and why they come into place. And we can again see the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in defining our rights to healthcare and who controls the healthcare and who gets the best healthcare. And as we come into place, what takes precedent and who gets the dollars. I guess we could be watching a number of films here, but one of them that strikes my mind is John Q. And if you've seen that film, it's a very well done film by Denzel Washington is the star of it, as we look at the fact that the rich can afford those specialized treatments that could have saved his son in the process, and the fight for that back and forth. So we see that healthcare is defined, instead of defining healthcare as a right in our system, healthcare is valued as a commodity and to the highest bidder. Real interesting as we start to look at some of the problems. Now, I will touch on the feminist perspective in this chapter because it's important, because the issue related to healthcare is very strong for women. Historically, medical science has focused on men. They did their research on men, and they neglected the issues of women. And yet, women have been highly medicalized by the current system. So things like childbirth, menopause, premenstrual syndrome, all have been medicalized. And it takes the power of the individual ability to control their health care away from them. So it also affects then what people think. The mommy job, the mom home to take care of the person, or the women's issue and how we're supposed to look. So we go back to some of those thoughts, even with those media influences pieces that we looked at. The interactionist perspective looks at health and illness, responsibility for the social construct. If we're ill as a child, how we define ourselves, the power of the doctor that comes into place, how we're educated, how we learn to protect ourselves from things like STDs, especially HIV and other things, and that individual perspective that comes into place. So as we look at the social problems of healthcare, we can clearly see that there are health inequities. Women live longer than men, but they have higher rates of chronic illness. And men experience higher rates of fatal illness, dying more quickly. Now, interestingly enough, if we tie this back to your other pieces of the course, when we look at family, men that are married live longer and they live healthier. That there is that influence as well of living with a woman, and the fact that she helps negotiate his health care. So it's an interesting piece. But by the age of 65, men die of cancer at twice the rate of women, which is interesting. Are they neglecting their health care in the process? Are they exposed to more chemical? We can really see some inequality going on here. Social class. Major determinants of one's health, where we live, what type of neighborhood, what we're exposed to, the hazardous chemicals, the jobs we do, the diet we eat, all comes into place. And education is significant. The better your education, the better your health. So for some pretty interesting issues as we look at those social influences coming into place, that healthy individuals are more likely to practice a healthier lifestyle. They're more likely to have more money and have insurance. They are more likely to use medical technology, and they're more well of health consequences. This is a population that will, with more education, are less likely to smoke, less likely to face the brown plague that we'll talk about in our next module. So some significant issues. But another major social problem is the cost of healthcare. The United States, significant cost for healthcare. We spend more per person on healthcare than any of the other first world countries, and that basically means that any other country. And yet there's some real strong inequalities that occur within health insurance, even with Affordable Care Act. Pretty important as we start to look at this, where everyone's mandated to have insurance. There are significant difference on what insurance policies you can afford to be in place and who's insured. So people with less income receive less health insurance, and in fact, those hurt most are the working poor. So as you start to explore this information in this chapter, you can see how much is really coming into place. To add to that, one of your videos here is the real reason American healthcare is so expensive. A neat little piece on what was going on and why it becomes so expensive. The second video I'm asking you to watch this first week is on Obamacare. Again, the Affordable Care Act is the right name for it. Understand that we've defunded part of this already since this was made, but also understand that the fact that it is working to have more people insured, and some information for you. With that, I will close this video, and for next week, you'll be looking at the issues of disability, but you can see they're one module together. You will have a discussion for both pieces. With that, hope you have a great week.